I guess I was muted. Hi. So with just the two of us, who's going to lead the class?
Hi.
Good to see you.
You too. I didn't know if I was actually on.
Yes, I know it was you. You know, you arrive at these things, and you're the first one there, and in fact, you know, for work we use the Microsoft team meetings, and so but there are a couple of meetings set up, and so there have been times I've accidentally clicked the wrong button, and then I was just sitting there by myself for a while until I realized that it was a different meeting I was supposed to click on. So it can be surprising at times.
Yeah, it can.
Sid, you're not pregnant and thinking about getting an abortion, are you?
David.
No.
We'll give people a couple minutes. We'll get started around 8:31, 8:32.
Okay.
How's everybody doing?
Brooke, sure, well, thanks.
Fine,
You?
Rabbi.
Good. Good. Thank God. Thank God. Yeah, my son is cutting a tooth, so last couple of nights have been a little bit rough, but par for the course.
What happens? So, Rabbi, it's interesting that Reb Moshe Feinstein would get so involved in this.
What do you mean?
Well, I'm just thinking during his time, he passed away in 86, I think. So it was only legal for 14 years. So, it was not was certainly nothing that was popular in the Orthodox community.
So it's actually how we're going to start the class. Is how he gets pulled into this. Yeah, I think we'll get started, and if more people show up, that's great. But we're gonna get started. So I'm gonna, as I do with all my shiurim, I'm gonna mute everybody, and everybody should feel free, if they have a comment, to unmute themselves and make the comment. I apologize. I'll just kind of scroll through the tshuva so you get a sense of just the size, but I did not have the ability to translate it, but I will go line everything that we're going to do. I'll make sure to translate and also do outside so that everyone can follow. But as you can see, this is 7 pages single spaced, and this is the tshuva. So we're gonna do sections of it. I'm gonna try and hit on most of the major points, and hopefully we'll come away with an understanding of Rav Moshe's viewpoint. So just a couple of, again, caveats for tonight's class. The first is just to make sure everyone knows where we're standing tonight. So tonight we're going to cover the view of Rav Moshe, and we're going to have one more class where we're going to cover the perspective of the Tzitz Eliezer, Rav Eliezer Waldenberg, who is the much more Mako position. Rav Moshe is the much more Machmir position. And we're gonna try to use each of them to understand and appreciate how these two camps build their perspectives. And it's very interesting to see. And it's also interesting to try and think through how they diverge so quickly at the very beginning of each one of the way that they structure and understand the entire sugya. With that short background, we're going to jump in. So tonight's class is going to be broken down into the following steps. The first thing that we're going to tackle is figure out what prompted Rav Moshe to get involved in this question. As David pointed out, this was not quite a prevalent reality in Jewish circles when Rav Moshe is posking about this, at least in America. And we're going to try and figure out what prompts him to write this tshuva. Two, we're going to have to pay attention very closely to the beginning of the tshuva when we go back to the beginning of the tshuva and figure out what are Rav Moshe's starting assumptions. Well, just the way that he frames the whole conversation is very powerful and important. And then we're going to get to Rav Moshe's proofs, and we're going to kind of evaluate them a little bit based off of some of our work that we did last week. We'll do that again so that if you weren't here, you'll be fine. And then we're going to try to deal with some of Rav Moshe's counter arguments that he tries to disprove the counter arguments, and we'll see him do some pretty not commonly done things, which is going to be quite interesting to just flesh out and show how far Rav Moshe felt, or how strongly he felt about this particular issue. It's really interesting when someone with really, really broad shoulders has a certain instinct on a particular topic, and that instinct or that assumption, or however you want to call it, seems to color almost everything that they see on the topic. It's very interesting, but that's going to be the overall arc of tonight's class. I hope it does not go quite as long as last time's class, but that's what we're going to be doing for tonight. So let's get started with what prompts the tshuva. So if you look over here, right here, kasavti. So at the very end, this is the very, very end of the tshuva, Rav Moshe basically explains why it is that he spends these 7 pages talking about this question. Kasafti kol zeh le'inyan hapirza hagdola ba'olam shemalchios deharbe medinos hitiru laharog ubrin ubetocham gam rashi medina b'medinas Yisrael. So I'm writing this tshuva because of the great breach that has happened in the world, that in many jurisdictions in many countries, they've made it allowed to abort babies. And amongst them are the heads of Medinat Yisrael, of Eretz Yisrael. Ukvar nergu ubrin la'in mispar shibiz right? And they've killed so many fetuses that you can't count. And at this moment in time, we need to create a fence around the Torah. And this is right already. You can hear where Rav Moshe's assumption is. We'll see this at the beginning of the tshuva even more hand, but assuming, as Rav Moshe does, that the isser, that the prohibition behind doing an abortion is in fact murder. Well, murder is one of those things that you're not going to find too many kulas for, right? Doesn't matter what the circumstances are. The only time where you're going to be allowed to murder someone is if that person is trying to murder somebody else. That is the only case where we are mekel in Ritzicha, is if there is one person trying to murder another person. So assuming abortion is murder, as we'll see his thought process in the beginning of the tshuva, right? You're not going to be able to find too many kulot to follow through with that assumption. And because of this, I was flabbergasted. I was very surprised when I saw a tshuva from one particular scholar in Eretz Yisrael, Hanichtav leminahel beit Beit HaCholem Shari Tzedek, right? That was written by the dean of Shari Tzedek Hospital, which is Tzitz Eliezer, by the way. Right, so he saw a tshuva of Tzitz Eliezer, and he was very surprised by what he saw. Unitpas bechavuras Asya, right? Yegimel. This is where he found it. Hamatir havado shayidei bechinos harofim shehu uber yoser megimel chadashim. So this was a fetus that was older than 3 months old, and based off of the input of the doctors, right? She'uber hu b'machalas Tay-Sachs, the baby had, based off of their tests, had the disease Tay-Sachs. Mitzad zeh hiktim she'etzem harigas ha'ubrin hu laharve poskim rachmi d'Rabbanan. And he said that the prohibition of aborting a baby is, according to many poskim, only rabbinic. V'af im hu midoraisa, and even if it is biblical, hu rak mishum geder beinenu shel olam aval machmas ibn nefashos a nidnud klal. Right? There might be some iser doraisa, like we talked about last week, maybe bal tashchis, or maybe right hotzar zer levatala. Right, different possibilities, right? Emitting seed in a non-right sexual context with your wife, right? Or wasting things, different possibilities. What the right that could have been if it's not murder, but that there is no possibility that aborting a baby is considered murder. That was the assumption of the Tzitz Eliezer, and based off that assumption, Tzitz Eliezer has his tshuva, which we're going to spend some time on next week. Rav Moshe says it's just completely wrong because it's absolutely murder. It's absolutely murder. And now we're going to get to see first his assumptions and as well as his attempting to make proofs. So if we go back to the very beginning of the tshuva. So he starts off the tshuva, right? He's writing to his son-in-law, Moshe Tendler, and Levar Sharigas Ubar Asura be'isur ritzicha bein ba'akum ben Yisrael. And right, he starts off, section A is to explain that the killing of a fetus is an isur of murder, both for non-Jews and for Jews. Hine. Badavar harigas ubar b'me'imo b'Yisrael mefurash b'tosvos Sanhedrin daf nun tes amid aleph dibar maschel leka the asur b'pshitus be'isur ritzicha. He says, straight up, it's very simple. If you take a look at Tosfos and Sanhedrin, Daf Nun Tes Amud Aleph 59a, you'll see Tosfos very clearly says that the isser of aborting a fetus for a Jew is based off of Isser Ritzicha, based off of murder, Mishum Deleka Medam the Yisrael Shav Akum Asur, because we don't find. The Gemara says that for an ubar, for a fetus, it is problematic for a non-Jew. It was actually from a pasuk in this past week's parsha, in Parshas Noach, right? That give me 1 second. Sorry. Oop. So if you remember, right? Hashofech dam hadam ba'adam damo shafech. This was the pasuk that's quoted for how we know that it's problematic for a non-Jew to kill a fetus. This was a pasuk in the context of Parshas Noach, talking to Noah, right? That if a person kills a person, so the way the Gemara reads it is hashofech dam hadam ba'adam. When you kill, when you spill blood of a person in a person. What's a person in a person? It's referring to a fetus. Damo shafech. Then you get. Basically, it's a capital crime. So it's only a capital crime for non-Jews. And Tosfos says, maybe you would think it's okay for Jews. No, it's not okay for Jews because mi'ikamidi, there is never something that we are allowed to do as Jews that's not allowed to non-Jews. That's the argument in Tosfos. However, what Rav Moshe really very quickly kind of assumes or argues is that the Tosfot actually says that it's an Isser D'Oraisa, that there's a biblical commandment, a biblical prohibition of murder when a Jew does an abortion. We spent a lot of time last week talking about these words. Afal gav de patur mikol makom lo shari. Even though when a Jew performs an abortion, it's not okay, says Tosfos. It's even though he's not going to be punished with a capital crime, nevertheless, it's not okay. Mikol makom lo shari. Now, somehow in these words, Rav Moshe sees a very clear indication that there is a biblical prohibition of ritzicha, of murder for a Jew. Only that you're not going to get a capital punishment. It's kind of like if you kill somebody who is going to die very soon thereafter, right? Someone who's very sick. If you kill such a person, so it is definitely murder. But if they are someone who's not going to live out the year, it's possible that you're not going to be chayiv misa. You're not going to be punished with death. If, let's say, someone warned you, 2 people warned you, you can't do this, blah, 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 and you do it anyways, you still would not be put to death for such an action, right? There are certain murders where halacha is not going to give you a capital crime. It doesn't make it less murder. That's Rav Moshe's major argument. But he's using this Tosfos as a proof to his position. Now, what I'll say is that this is a terrible proof to your position because Tosfos is really unclear. Really unclear. You could read it like Rav Moshe. You could. But you could read it like the views that are against Rav Moshe. So when you have a proof that you can read however you want, that's normally not a very good proof because then everybody is just going to take that same information and read it the way that they want to read it. And then everyone can just scream and yell at each other. And you're never going to come to a conclusion because I read it one way, you read it the other way. And that's fine. So we're going to get to part of what's behind Rav Moshe's overall argument. I suspect it doesn't come up in the tshuva at all, but I suspect that from having conversations with his son-in-law, with Rabbi Tendler and Rav Moshe's ability to tap into the medical community, that when you speak to doctors, fetuses, especially when they get to a certain stage in their development, are very much alive, and so. Even though Rav Moshe never says this, and maybe I'm putting words into his mouth, but he has such a strong assumption that it's murder that part of me feels like he must have been swayed by something. It's so hard to figure out exactly what prompted it, but we'll leave it as still an open question of what prompts Rav Moshe to come to his conclusion. And you'll see some of the other proofs that he brings. So this is number one. It's this Tosfos. And as we said last time, this Tosfos is pretty problematic as a proof one way or the other because it could be read in either direction. Right? V'kolkach pshita lehu dehu aser be'isser ritzicha ad shehukshu lefi ma shahayu sovrim bekushatam uv'teretz rishon de'akum aser laharga sa'ubar lahatzil asimo eich mutter zev Yisrael hatzrucha l'taritz dehu mishum de Yisrael ika mitzvah laharog. Right? So he says that's why they needed to ask, why is it mutter for a Jew, right, to abort the baby in certain circumstances? Because it's murder, right? So because it's murder, they needed to, right, go to the opposite. If it's murder, then how could it ever be okay, right? And so that's right. So fine. So well, that's basically how he reads Tosfos. We noted already that that's problematic. Good. Second, so we're going to skip a little bit. He spends a lot of time going back and forth, but I'm going to try and show you a good part of this tshuva, and I can't focus on everything. So the second thing that I want to focus on is another controversial aspect of Rav Moshe's argument. The second argument, this is probably the most controversial part of the entire tshuva, probably. But here, so if you recall, there was a Tosfos in Nida that we talked about last week also, which used the language of mutter when talking about abortion. That at least in their questions, they were questioning in a way that seemed to indicate that perhaps it was okay to do abortion, right? It's right over here, right? Right? And up here, the mutter lahorgo bebeten, right? It's talking about the baby, right? That you can kill the baby. It's mutter to kill the baby, right? So earlier we talked about how we saw patra of al-asr, right? That it's not a capital offense, but it's still problematic. This Tosfos plays with the possibility that it's actually completely okay to do an abortion. Now, Rav Moshe cannot accept that because again, he assumes it's murder. So how on earth can Tosfos say that it's mutter? It's not feasible. Right? So he's repeating himself. Sometimes when you repeat yourself 100 times, it's actually shows the weakness of your argument because you keep on saying the same thing again and again and again. But right, this Tosfos, he says, proves without a shadow of a doubt that in fact it is a biblical prohibition of ritzicha. V'ein letos milashon Tosfos nida, and don't tell me, oh, there's a Tosfos in nida daf mem dalad alaf dir masel iu shikasu shnei pamim lashon mutter lahargo, that 2 times it says the language that it's okay to kill the fetus. Bekushiatam, right, in their question mark, im tim salomer the mutter lahargo bebeten afilu meita imo. If you're going to tell me that it's mutter, it is okay to kill the fetus even when the mother had already passed away. It's not like a baby is just sitting in a box. Right? Then why is it that a fetus, one is allowed to violate a biblical prohibition of Shabbos to save the fetus? If you're allowed to save the fetus, then how can you kill the fetus? Right? You're allowed to violate a biblical prohibition of carrying on Shabbos to bring a knife to rip open the mother to save the baby. Right? So you're telling me that even though you're allowed to violate Shabbos to save the baby, you're also allowed to kill the baby? The pashut ubarur, it is simple and clear, shehu tos sofer, that this Tosfos is a mistake. The words mutter should not be there. Ritzarach ligrost imtim slomer de pater hahorgo bebeten, and you should erase the words mutter in that Tosfos and replace them with the words pater. That even though you're not going to get a capital punishment for killing the baby, it's still ritzicha. It's still murder. That's what Rav Moshe wants us to do with that Tosfos. Shehu delo kedekatsu dechayev al harigas ubar shekvar meita imo. Right? Fine. And he repeats himself that in both cases it should say patur, not mutter. Right? So what's the main part of it? The main thrust of his argument? The main thrust of his argument is if you can violate Shabbos, if you not only can you, right? One second. Right, the Eich Shaykh Lahav Uriah may go say Shehu Isser Be'Isser Etzich fine. Shagam Ken Yu Machalin Alav the Shabbos Ela Muchrachin Lomar Shehu Tov Sofer Bavor Hu Aser Ach Shepater. L'Achein Ika Raya De Al Mi Shileka Chiyav Misa Horgo Machalin Alav the Shabbos. Right, so 1 second. Right here's the part I want to read. V'chi Chilo Shabbos Talui Bertzono. Right, if someone's life is in jeopardy, is Chil Shabbos, right, a question? Meaning, is it up to your desires? If someone's life's in jeopardy, do you say, well, I have a choice now. I can violate Shabbos to save this guy, or I can keep Shabbos and not save this guy? No. V'chi Chil Shabbos Talui Bertzono Shel Adam D'im Yertzeh Lo Yatzil V'im Yargu V'gam Yargu Be'adayim. Right. So if you have to save him on Shabbos, right? It's a chiyuv to save him on Shabbos. If someone's life is in jeopardy, even the ubar, it is an obligation to save this ubar. If it's an obligation to save the ubar, how can you possibly tell me that it's mutter to abort the ubar? That you're allowed to abort the baby? Those two things, said Moshe, cannot exist at the same time. Now, this logic, though I think on the face of it makes a lot of sense, is not necessarily consistent with all of the Rishonim. There are Rishonim out there, including the Ramban, which we're not going to get into, even though he does try to address it towards the end of this tshuva. But the Ramban and others make the following counter argument. They say that the idea of saving a life for Shabbos purposes is because of a special halacha, specifically in Shabbos, which is that we violate Shabbos to save a life, because if you save that life, there will be many more Shabbatot kept by that same life. So it's not about a right v'chai bahem, that the mitzvahs are about living, and which is the normal calculus of saving someone in the context of some sort of isser. For Shabbos, one of those suggestions is actually rejected in the Gemara, but it comes back in many iterations in the Poskim and in the Rishonim. So one idea of saving a fetus or saving a person on Shabbos is so that they can keep many Shabbatot in the future. So the reason that that's important is because that is an example of what we talked about last week of Halacha X situation Y, which basically translates to you can have two totally contradictory realities, right? This baby here might not be considered a full life until it's born, right? Which is the other side to this, right? That it's not a full life yet until it's born. If that's true, why are you allowed to be Machal Shabbos for a non-full life? The answer is because if you save this non-full life, it can develop into a full life that will keep many more Shabbatot in the future. And so even though you're violating one Shabbos, right, the net Shabbos keeping of this right baby, we're assuming is going to be greater than the one Shabbos that you're violating to save it, even though it might not be considered a full life. So you can, on the one hand, say it's not a full life, so maybe you can abort it, but at the same time, you are obligated to save it, right? If, right, you think you can or whatnot, in terms of, right, that's how you kind of separate, divide, and conquer. And even though they seem to be completely opposite in terms of their orientation, it's possible that you can actually separate and answer each one to by itself. So that's how you, right, disagree with that logic of Moshe. That logic is very compelling, though, right? And that logic, I think, is probably one of Moshe's best arguments by itself. But the fact that in order to make that, he's right willing to rewrite words in Tosfot, that's a little bit of a hard stretch, right? Calling something a Tos Sofer it's the nuclear option, right? That's like the you don't want to use that option, because right then people at that point you can do whatever you want, right? Whenever you see something that you don't like, you just change it, because it can't be what it means. I mean, just imagine if whatever in the wrong hands, that's a very dangerous tool. Okay, so let's get to his probably his best proof, textual proof in the Rishonim, and that is the Rambam. So we talked about this Rambam also at the end of last week. And the Rambam, so even though the Gemara in many places seems to indicate that a fetus is not quite a nefesh, or is not a fully developed nefesh, or is not all the different languages, or it's just mammon. There's lots of different ways of the Gemara talking about the fetus that don't seem to talk about it as a human life that's being murdered, which is, again, Rav Moshe's assumption. But the Rambam, when the Rambam talks about killing a fetus, he only talks about one case, and he's very specific. And Rav Moshe picks up on that and says that when the Rambam only chose that one case to talk about, the reason he chose that one case and the way that he frames it is very bedavka, meaning he says, I'm reading the Rambam with, right, as opposed to Tosfos, where he's kind of crossing words out, he's saying the Rambam, every single word counts, right? So watch what he does. So in the Rambam, the first chapter, the 9th halacha, mefurash od yoter, it's explained, the harigas ubar hu ritzicha mamish, that killing a baby is absolute murder. Sharei kasav, how do we know that? Because it's written there, tamal mashe makshe leiled, mutter lachto chaubar sheme'eh. Right? When are you allowed to abort a baby? Specifically when it's hard for a woman to give birth, meaning she's having a troublesome birth, a troublesome pregnancy, and in order to save the mother's life, right? So the mother's life is in jeopardy. Only in this case is one allowed to abort the baby. That's how the Rambam frames this. Because the baby is like a rodev, after her, lahorga. V'hu mehadin dechayva Torah l'chol Yisrael lahatzil hanirdaf, and this din of killing the baby, killing the fetus, is like any other halacha of one person trying to kill another person, which is the one case where you're allowed to murder someone in order to save somebody else, because the person who you're murdering is trying to murder that third party. Afilu benafsho, even with his life, shall rodev. Afilu sharodev hukatan, even if it's a little kid and the kid doesn't, right, maybe necessarily even understand what's going on. It's a baby inside the mother's womb. Still, it's called a rodev. Va'afkish rodev onus, even if the rodev is an onus, it's right, it has no control over a situation. If he is a rodev, you're still allowed to kill the person. Hare desover de af shepater hu al kol panim le'inyan ha'isr kiritzicha mamish. Right, so even though, yes, you're right, it's pater, right? It's pater. You're not going to get the capital crime for killing the ubar. Nevertheless, it's mamish, absolutely like murder. Shalachein haya asr lahorgo. Therefore, you can't kill the ela michiyov hatzala. You can't kill the baby unless you're doing it in the context of saving the mother. Af benefesh harodev, right, with the life of the pursuer, which in this case is the baby. And after the Rambam talks about this, the hala that you shouldn't have mercy on the pursuer, and then he says lefichach, right? Therefore, right? That's how the Rambam phrases it. After he says, therefore the rabbis taught us that you can abort a baby when it's putting the mother's life in jeopardy. Right? With great care, the Rambam wrote his tshuva. 2 times he wrote the hu davka machmas sha'ubar hu bedin rodev. Twice he wrote in the span of 2 lines. Very specific. The Maimonides wrote the only time you're allowed to abort a baby if it's in the context of the baby pursuing the mother's life. And whenever the Rambam uses the language of lefichach, therefore, the Rambam is doing something, right, very specific with that. All the explainers of the Rambam, whenever the Rambam uses the language of lefichach, they have spent a whole time trying to explain what it means. Shivadahu rak b'shvil zeh sober Rambam mashem mutar lahargo. That is, this is the only reason that one would be able to abort a baby is because the baby is killing the mother. V'im hayashayach she is damein sharigas ubar is shel ezo isha yatzil nefesh acher she'eno rodfo haya asur lahargo. And therefore, if let's say somehow, and I don't know exactly what this case would ever look like, but in theory, if killing the fetus of this woman somehow is going to save some other life, which is not connected, right? Maybe this is saying for stem cells or for, I don't know, like some other, I'm not sure exactly how this would work, but you're killing this baby in order to save somebody else that's not connected to this, but meaning the baby is not pursuing that life. The baby is only pursuing the mother's life. That's when it's allowed, right? But if somehow killing the baby is going to save some third party, which is the baby's not pursuing, it would be problematic, says Rav Moshe, to kill the baby, to abort the baby in that case, because in that case, it's not the classical case of Rodev. The Masha Patra Harigasumi Misa Eino Klum Lahorgo Bishvil Hatzalas Nefesh Shehu Chayavin Alav Misa Kahad Treifa Datzalas Nefesh Shalem She'ein HaTreifa Rodev. Right, just like you can't kill a treifa in order to save some third party if the treifa, if the person who's going to die within the year is not the person who's pursuing. Right? Maybe meaning maybe you should make a cost benefit analysis. Oh, this person's going to die within the year. It's kind of like, right, someone has they have terminal illness, right? This is like a classic like movie situation, right, where someone's like dying anyways, right? And so they're dying anyways. So often they become the hero because they like throw their life to save everybody else because they're dying anyways. So that's not the scenario. The scenario is you have a choice. You can kill this person who's dying anyways in order to save some third party, and somehow they're connected, but they're not connected in a Rodev situation. So you're not allowed to do that, even though killing that person who's a treifa, whose life is going to end soon, you're not going to be chayav misa. You're not going to be killed for it. It doesn't mean that it's okay. It's still ritzicha. It's still murder. Right? The hu pashat hu bedin yaharg val yavor. He says it's still considered that you have to give up your own life before you do it. In other words, he's saying there, which is actually a very big chiddush, that it's right to abort a baby. It's yaharg val yavor. It's yaharg val yavor. You have to give up your life before you do it. That's a pretty bold expansion from already saying that it's ritzicha is pretty bold, and Rav Moshe goes even beyond that. We did very Havel Haim Lomar Rambam, and so this is my favorite part, right? So literally like a couple paragraphs up, he literally said Tos Sofer on Tosfos. So here he says of a different Havel, it's emptiness to say that the Rambam was not careful, right? Because of Tam Sheker, and he gave a reason, but it's not the real reason, right? Shleka Klal, right? V'tama emezu machmas shaleka iser etzicha al uber k'shadayin lo yatsa rosho. Right, and that the real reason that the Rambam is saying that he doesn't actually say it, but the real reason why you're allowed to abort the fetus is because the baby is not a real baby until it's born. That's ridiculous. You can't say that because the Rambam didn't say that. You're stripping words into the Rambam. He never said that. Avshalo his kiru klal afilu beremes. Even though he doesn't mention this, even with a hint, we'll see. Well, it's very interesting how right when something fits with your overall perspective. Sometimes you're willing to do certain things, and then when something fits with your perspective and somebody else tries to do that same thing, you're like, you can't do that. You can't do that. Anyways, it just reminds me of all the politics that are going on in the world right now, which is always so funny. V'gam hu zilzu al kol piskei harambam. Right? This is an embarrassment for all the psakim of the Rambam. Shebechol sfarok shenema kain. All of his works and all of his writings, you're going to basically just say, yeah, the Rambam wasn't being so careful with his words over here. So yeah, he said Rodev, but he meant Rodev and because the baby's not a baby till it's born. Okay, so the Rambam is actually a pretty good source for Moshe. The other side will try to address the Rambam, but they don't do a great job addressing the Rambam. Their more fruitful approach is to basically say everybody disagrees with the Rambam, right? And the Rambam is a das yachid, and then put the Rambam on an island. That's the simplest way that the other side deals with the Rambam, but maybe we'll see a little bit of how they try to reread the Rambam next week. But personally, I think the Rambam is probably in Rav Moshe's camp. Okay, so now those are Rav Moshe's two major proofs. The Tosfos in Sanhedrin, which is a terrible proof, and the Rambam, which only mentions the concept of abortion in the context of Rodef and no other case. And right, the language of the Rambam is very carefully worded that seems to kind of put an emphasis on that fact. So that is Rav Moshe's major makor. The next thing Rav Moshe has to do is okay, right. So this is just one interesting point that I want to make before I get to the next section. But the next section we're going to be doing is basically the counter arguments. But before we get there, if you recall, many of the Gemaras that we saw do use the language of, right, that the baby's not quite a baby yet. So how does Rav Moshe read all of those Gemaras? Right? What does he do with all those Gemaras? So this is basically his approach. That the fetus is considered alive. That, right, it's so much alive that there is an isser of, right, do not murder, just like a baby that's born. Right, so then why are you allowed, if that's true, then why do we favor the mother over the baby? Right? One of the things you have to figure out, right, because we say in the Gemara that when the baby's in utero, then we favor the mother's life over the baby's life. Once the baby is, right, Yatsa Rosho or Yatsa Ruvo, depending on the Girsa, which we saw two of last week, whether it's the head or most of the baby, right, comes out, at that point, we can't kill the baby because we're not going to choose one life over the other life. Fine. So according to the Rambam, if the baby is completely alive and you violate murder for killing the baby, why do we choose the baby's life over the mother's life? Her life comes before the baby's life. Because it's true that in terms of complete life force, she is better than the baby. Shehi nefesh gamor. She is a complete life. She'al zeh haverak ha'ubar rodef v'lo isha. And her completeness doesn't mean the baby is not alive and doesn't have the isser etzicha. No. We're not willing to go that far. But the fact that she is alive in the world and the baby is still in utero is at least going to give her a leg up when she's going head to head, so to speak, with the baby in the context of rodef, of who's killing who. Okay? So basically what Rav Moshe does is he limits greatly what the Gemara is doing whenever it says that the baby is not a full baby, but not a full life. What does it mean? All it means, the only thing it means, is that in the context of Rodef, baby loses to mother. That's it. That is the only thing that does. It doesn't actually tell you that the baby is not really fully alive. It is fully alive, and there's murder. You don't get killed for that murder, okay? Technicality, right? But why does the mother win out? Because she's in the world, and that's the only difference. That's how Rav Moshe kind of rereads all those Gemaras. Even though, again, it's a little bit betochak. It's a little bit of a hard reading of a lot of Gemaras, but I highlighted that because I thought that was important to try to address how he kind of addresses that. Okay. Now, this is going to be even crazier. So once you say that the only time that you can abort the baby is if it is, in fact, a Rodef situation, so Rodef has certain rules. And once you're assuming that the only time to abort a baby is Rodef, you have to follow those rules. So this is how far Moshe takes this idea. Even when the doctors tell me that there is a possibility that the mother might die from this pregnancy, if you don't kill the fetus, b'midas chashash shamru daha gam b'shvil safek katan v'sek sfeika mechalin. And even though when it comes to saving the life of the fetus, even if it's a sfek sfeika, even if it's a double doubt, we're still going to say violate Shabbos and do it, even though the chances of it being an actual danger are very small. Nevertheless, laharoges ha'ubar yia asur ajitiya ha'omdana larofim gedola karov levadai. If for the doctors to do the abortion on this baby, the doctors have to be close to certain that the mother's life is actually in jeopardy, which basically translates in the year 2020 that almost never, because generally speaking, bisman hazeh, with the advances in modern medicine, right, unbelievably, doctors can do a C-section and take out a baby, even a preemie, much earlier than ever before, and keep the baby in the NICU and nurse it to health. And so there are going to be very few cases that they're going to have to abort the baby in order to save the mother. And so reading this little section over here is going to, I don't know, but just about every case is going to be problematic to do an abortion, according to Moshe, with how much he extends this to the strict reading of following the rules of Rodef. Dumi tachinechshav Rodef tzarich sheyeh ke'ein vadai shu Rodef. Right? Since the only reason it's okay is because he's a Rodef, then it has to be clear that he's a Rodef. The gam pashut she'ein chiluk lefize bein havlados. And now he gets into a little bit of addressing some of the Tzitz Eliezer's psak, and therefore it shouldn't make difference what type of vlad, what type of fetus we're talking about. Even if it's a non-viable fetus, it's not going to live a long period of time, right? That they're going to be born with a terrible disease called Tay-Sachs, and they're only going to live till 5 at most, right? Probably even less. Even with all the tests, they clarify he's going to be a Tay-Sachs baby or she's going to be a Tay-Sachs baby, because until there's an actual sakana, an actual danger to the mother, you're not allowed to abort the fetus. If the baby's not rodef, it's not okay. And this is an important line, but it's not surprising, right? Even if the pain of giving birth to a Tay-Sachs baby is going to be very great, and even if the father and mother might get sick, right? Probably referring to some depression or some other things, right? That's not going to factor in if we're talking about murder, right? If we're talking about d'Rabbanans, or we're talking about some other isurim, potentially even d'oraisa, but not murder, then you open up the possibility, especially d'Rabbanans, right, for things like tsar ha'im, things like the pain towards the mother, or other things as factors that could contribute to a reason to be makil in certain circumstances. So that's why he's saying this is not going to fly, because for him it has to be a situation of rodef, mamish rodef, umdina, right, with the assumption that you can establish that it's very, very likely rodef, very likely that the baby is pursuing the mother's life. In that case, and only that case, can you abort the baby. Times that amarti la rofim shomrei Torah, and this is you'll find in certain circles, right? I therefore tell doctors who are shomrei Torah, shelo yasu bedika. They shouldn't do this test as to whether the baby's Tay-Sachs or not, right? So he's not talking here about Dor Yesharim or getting your genetics tested before you get married. But once you are married already, and maybe you know you're a carrier, maybe you don't know you're a carrier. At that point, Ramosha says, why do the test? You're just gonna put yourself through so much stress. There's no what do you gain? You can't abort the baby. All you're doing is causing 9 more extra months of pain and anguish. And they're gonna basically go to someone else to abort the baby. and then you're going to be causing, right, this person to violate meaning in front of a blind person, right? You're basically putting a stumbling block because it's going to be too hard of a challenge that they're not going to overcome. Which is a fascinating couple of lines there. I'll leave them for you guys to mull over. But this is how Ramosha, right, structures his tshuva, right? At first, he establishes from the very beginning his assumption going in, this is Ritzicha. He has one svara and two makoros that are his real sources. The makor number one is the Tosfos in Sanhedrin, which is a terrible makor because it's a very unclear Tosfos and can be read in multiple ways. And he has the view of the Rambam, which he reads very much bidavka, that the Rambam is being very specific in what he's saying. And I think it's a very fair reading of the Rambam. And his svara is that if we're chayav, if we're obligated to save the baby and violate Shabbos in order to do so, how can it be mutter? How can it be okay to kill the baby? It's just to abort the baby. It's just not feasible that those two things can be true at the same time. So much so that he rereads and says Taos Sofer to a Tosos in Nida and says you cannot read it as mutter. It should say patur, but you can't read it as saying that it's okay to abort the baby. Okay, so that's the main structure of what he says to this point, which is it's murder. The only time it's okay is rodef, is if the baby's pursuing the mother. And I have Tosos, I have Rambam, I have my Svara, and I'm good to go. Now, from this point on, Rav Moshe is playing defense. So Rav Moshe, from this point forward, is trying to address the many teshuvot that came out in the hundreds of years before Rav Moshe dealt with this question, of earlier poskim who dealt with aspects of this question in different contexts, and basically how he tries to address these other things. So you have here, we're not going to get into them too deeply. Maybe in the future shir, we'll go through the Yavitz, Rav Yaakov Emden. That tshuva is unbelievable. I mean, the amount of crazy things that Rav Yaakov Emden says in that tshuva, unbelievable. But maybe we'll get to that tshuva at some point. Definitely not in the next two classes. But the basically what he has to address is the Chavos Yair, Rav Yair Bakrak, who was I'm blanking on where he was the rabbi. It's fine. It's fine. So the Chavos Yair is number one you have to deal with. You have to deal with the Ramban, which we're not going to spend too much time on. You have to deal with the Ramban's the only Rishon that he deals with in this context, but the Chavos Yair, the Maharit, another important posek who has tshuvot on this topic, and then the Yavitz. Those four are the four sources that he tries to play defense on and tries to basically upschlag each one, so that, because a lot of these are the basis for some of the Kula perspectives as well. So he knows that, and so he is trying to address them. Okay, so the first one, the Chavos Yair, we're not even going to get into really the main question and discussion, because he does a very cheap shot here, right? And again, you appreciate how he does this, right? Ayanti b'Chavos Yair siman lamed aleph mashkasa meitosos nida, that his right the foundation of the Chavos Yair's Mekel Psak is that controversial Tosos and Nida that Rav Moshe said is a Taos Sofer, that has made a mistake. They use the mashma de below akar havlad mutter lahorgo, that even as long as the baby didn't leave the mother's womb, you're allowed to abort the baby. Haya zemi lashon mutter lahorgo, and he uses that language of Tosos as a linchpin for his halachic decision. Aval ha yafshal omar kain, but you can't say that. The mutter lahargo lo hayashayach sheichal Shabbos, because if it's mutter to kill the baby, then you shouldn't be able to save the baby on Shabbos. You shouldn't be able to violate Shabbos to save the baby if it's mutter to kill the baby. Make up your mind. Which one is it? So that means that that Tosfos doesn't make sense. That Tosfos is wrong. So if that's the linchpin of your argument, I don't have to address it, because I already addressed it by saying that Tosfos, your whole source, is Ta'us Sofer, is a mistake. And so that's basically how he upshlugs, right, the first tshuva that he has to deal with, the Chavos Yair. It's based off of a faulty source. So here, so with the Marit, we're not going to get into so much either, right? But I just want to kind of show you what he does with each one of these. It's really an unbelievable. So if you've learned some tshuvas of Moshe, I haven't done so many, but I've done enough that to tell you that in my little sample size, this is a very out of character Rav Moshe, right? He does a lot of stuff in this tshuva that's very questionable. Now, when that happens and you have broad shoulders, so you have like this like a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, it shows his conviction, right? It shows how much he felt this to be the case, that he's willing to do some crazy stuff in order to convey his opinion. So that's a scary place to be if you're against Rav Moshe, that Rav Moshe was so, right, such a fire on this side, and to go up against him. On the flip side, some of it is weak sauce, right? Like this Rav Moshe has a lot of weaknesses. There's a lot of points that you can really pick on and highlight, right, the problems with them, and people do. So it's a little bit of an interesting, right, depending on, right, on how much you're how afraid you are to debate with Rav Moshe will impact a little bit on how do you try to approach this. So again, I'm a nobody in this, so I'm trying to with a level head try to appreciate, understand what Rav Moshe is doing and some of the issues with what Rav Moshe is doing. But in terms of a final psak, it's a very scary place to be when you're on the wrong side of Rav Moshe. So we'll leave it there. So if you look at here, Vaniti Marit Sheikat Shtei Chuvos. So the Marit has two chuvos, right? Again, I just think about politics, and I think it's so funny sometimes when you think about these things, right? So the Marit flip-flops in his two chuvos, right? Sosros b'chelek echad. They conflict each other. In Siman Zayin, it sounds like you're only allowed to do an abortion if there's a danger to the mother. Fine. But Siman Sadik Tes, Kasav the Afti Yisrael's Machmas Ibud Nefashos Ein Klal. Right? But there he says that in terms of murder, there's no possibility at all. So which one is it? Is it only mutter in the context of Rodef, or right? So basically, one tshuva sides with Rav Moshe, one tshuva sides with the alternative. So what does Rav Moshe do? You can't look at these tshuvos. He flip flops. He goes back and forth. It must be one of these tshuvas is a false one. A student that didn't understand him properly and wrote a mistaken tshuva in his name. So we don't know which one's which, so we can't rely on the Marit one way or the other, right? So we crossed out the Chavos Yair because he relies on the Tosos that has Ta'us Sofer. And now the Marit, he says in one place he says like me, in another place he says not like me. So it's a stira, so we're just going to throw out the baby with the bathwater. They're both wrong. And then he says, and this is also very interesting, right? So he quotes Rav Unterman, who is another big posek who, I don't know if he's related to Effie or not, but this Rav Unterman also had a lot of tshuvos on this topic at this time. So he kind of predates Rav Moshe, so Rav Moshe quotes him. Alagam tshuva zu ms nira, right? And if you want to say that the Marit is true, that you're allowed to abort the baby and there's no nidnud klal of the baby being of it being a real baby, right? So maybe like Rav Unterman says, the sham the hayazeb makom arba kodem arba'im yom, right? So basically he makes an umdana, he makes an assumption of the case that the Marit was talking about, even though, again, we're not going to look at the Marit inside, but the Marit does not say this. The Marit does not clarify that this is talking about a baby within 40 days of conception. But he says, if you want to say that, right, oh, you're allowed to abort the baby, that's only true before 40 days, right? And this is, again, right, we saw this Gemara about eating truma for a Bas Kohen who gets married and then her husband dies, and right, she's allowed to eat for 40 days. And then we can clarify if she's pregnant, then she can't eat anymore. If she's not pregnant, then she can continue to eat. And if she's pregnant, why is she allowed to eat for the first 40 days? Because the Gemara says the baby was Maya Ba'alma. The baby was just water for the first 40 days. So that's the source that there's something that changes about the embryo pre and post 40 days. Okay, so this is also a major chiddush, right? To just read into a tshuva, to limit the tshuva that says that there's no problem of aborting a baby to 40 days when the tshuva itself never says that, is a pretty large limitation that you would think the tshuva would say by itself. Nevertheless, again, Rav Moshe is trying to play defense against some of the counter arguments. Okay, this area over here, he talks about the Surah Eish and the Ramban, because the Surah Eish is all based on the Ramban, which is why the Ramban is the big source that disagrees again with his svara, with his logic that if you have to save the baby, you can't kill the baby, right? So the Ramban disentangles those two things, and that's a lot of what the Surah Eish talks about. And so Rav Moshe, right, spends a lot of time. I went through this a couple of times this afternoon. I'm still not sure I fully understand the back and forth, so I don't feel comfortable teaching it just yet. Maybe at some point we'll get back into it. And then the last tshuva is the Yavitz. So Rav Yaakov Emden, the son of the Chacham Tzvi, right, the curmudgeon-y rabbi who got into the big fight with Yonason Eibeshitz in the Emden Eibeshitz controversy. So he was a little pulpit rabbi back in Hamburg, Altona Wadsbeck, the triple community, and he has it's a crazy tshuva about a woman who is pregnant with a mamzer, a Ashes Ish, a married woman who has an affair and gets pregnant, and the mother wants to abort the baby, and the Yavitz, right, basically does something that his tshuva is in a separate category than the others, because his whole argument is very specific to this case of a mamzer, and how in the times if we had a court, this woman would be chayav misa. She would be put to death, and if she would be put to death, then we wouldn't wait for the baby to be born. We would kill her with the baby, which we saw that Gemara also. And so therefore, you can kill the baby because the baby is already considered like it's dead, even though we don't have a court and we don't, right, do deaths today, right, in a Jewish court. So his whole tshuva is really, he says a lot of pretty crazy stuff. But let's see if I can find the line. Go back, sorry. All right, give me 1 second. I thought I underlined it, but I apparently didn't. Oh, here. V'nei b'she'elas hayayvetz simen mem gimel ra'isi dvarim shelo natnu la'amar. I saw things written that shouldn't have been said. She'be'ubar mamzer matzu la'apilo mitam sha'isha bizman shahayu sanhedrin mashleches hagazis hayu machayvin osa misa. Right, this woman, because she cheated on her husband and she was married, that in the time of Sanhedrin she'd be chayav misa, and therefore you can abort the baby. Yolad, we wouldn't wait for the baby to be born. Mikra degam shnehem nechshav havlad kivar katal, and therefore the baby is already considered like it's dead, so you can kill it. It's a mitzvah to, right, to it's just unbelievable. V'ashes ma'azelik is Sanhedrin, even though we know it's Sanhedrin, v'avdina lo gamru, and we didn't have an actual court case, lo yigmer lo misa, and they never got Poskim that she's chayiv misa, the gamlo husru, and she wasn't warned. Din dal misos lo bitlu. Somehow, right? Still, the fact that the baby is chayiv, one of the dal misos is not been right gotten rid of. Okay, so basically he thinks that this is crazy. Right? Umamish dvarim betelim heim av shekasav ze adam gadol. Right? These things are ridiculous. Even if a great person wrote them, he was just wrong. So this is basically right the Rav Moshe's approach, and this is his whole tshuva. Right now we're back at the end where he basically says, "Why did I get involved? Because someone told me about what's going on in Eretz Yisrael, and so I decided to write this tshuva." So let's just summarize the takeaways. So again, Rav Moshe starts this tshuva with an immediate assumption that the Isser that extends from the non-Jewish world, the Gemara talked about that we did last week, that it expands to the Jewish world as well. Because of mi'ika midi, it can't be something as an usher to non-Jews and mutter for Jews, must be problematic. And how is it problematic? The same way it's problematic for non-Jews. It's ritzicha for them, capital offense. For Jews, it's ritzicha, just not capital offense, because the baby technically has not been born yet. What are my proofs? Well, Tosfos says that it's usher because of mi'ika midi, and it's usher because of ritzicha. Tosfos doesn't say that, but he says that. Then he says there's also a really good svara, a really good logical argument, which is that if you're chayiv, if you're obligated to save the baby and violate Shabbos to do so, then how can you tell me that you're allowed to abort the baby? That is if you want a soundbite, that's Rav Moshe's soundbite. That argument would be what he would put on all of his ads if he was trying to convince everybody, right, that he was right. If you have to save the baby, how can you kill the baby? And then he goes into the Rambam and says the Rambam is with me. The only case that you're allowed to do an abortion is the case of Rodef. And he goes so far to say that therefore it's Yaharig Val Yavor. You have to give up your life before you abort the baby. The only time you're allowed to abort the baby is if you're sure it's Rodef. If you're not sure it's Rodef, you can't do it. It has to be an umdana that's very likely. It's Karov Levada. It has to be close to being indefinite reality that the mother is going to die. Anything else is not okay. And doesn't matter what the baby is. Baby's Tay-Sachs, baby's healthy, baby's Downs. I don't care. Baby is a life, and you're killing the life, and you're not allowed to do that. What about all the tshuvas that came beforehand? What about the Tosfos that says mutter, Taos Sofer, Mizuyaf, crazy talk, right? He basically dismisses everything that's against him, and chik-chak. Why did I write this? I wrote this because I saw this is a big problem in the world, and even in Eretz Yisrael, I saw a tshuva from the Tzitz Eliezer, and I was very surprised, and so I decided to write this tshuva. That's the approach of Rav Moshe, and next week we will deal with the Tzitz Eliezer and the counter argument, which is willing to do abortions up to 7 months in certain circumstances. And after we finish the tshuva of the Tzitz Eliezer, hopefully also next week, I'm going to try to, again, lay out some of the thoughts of Rav Aaron Lichtenstein about the sliding scales and how there's a lot of moving components, a lot of moving parts. A posek has to be able to appreciate the nuances of every situation, try to figure out what's the best way to move forward. It's complicated, it's nuanced, and we do our best to work with people to get what we need to get. Any thoughts or questions before we end? I'll stop the share here and open it up for questions.
So the only Rabbi Unterman that I would know of at the time was the chief rabbi of Israel. It was Effie's cousin.
Oh, yeah?
And he was in the late 60s and I think early 70s. He was the chief rabbi of Israel.
Interesting.
So Ashkenazi.
Right. So I have to look. I honestly I'm not familiar with him too much. I only saw him quoted in different places and in Rav Moshe's Tshuva. in this topic. I've never heard him like quoted anywhere else. So I don't have context, and I didn't have time to really look into him. It's a long tshuva, and it's a little bit of a complicated tshuva. So trying to just get down the major arguments in an organized fashion was a beast by itself.
I mean, it's probably not unusual for the chief rabbi of Israel. He does a lot of administrative things more than
Yeah, for
tshuvas,
sure.
wouldn't you say? Yeah. So it wouldn't be unusual for that to be.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you everybody
Yep.
for
Thank
for
you.
Thank you,
signing on.
Rabbi.
You're Rabbi.
And
See you
we'll do the last piece next week.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Okay. Good night.
All right.
Night.